Colleagues and stakeholders who are connecting online can hear us. My colleagues will indicate if they are able to hear the sound and they're able to follow the proceedings. Ms. Barbara Creecy, Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Ms. Nomusa Dube-Ngube, Premier of KZN, who's attending virtually. Presidential Climate Commission Commissioners. Mr. Maisela Kekana, the Deputy Director, Climate Change and Equality, who's also our Chief Negotiator. Dr. Crispin Olver, the Executive Director of the PCC. Ms. Lebogang Mulaisi, the COO of the PCC. Ms. Reitumetsi Molosone, who's the Head of Environment from the National Business Initiative. Social partners present here, stakeholders, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Peter Mbelengwa. I'm the Chief Director of Communication at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Welcome to this National Stakeholder Consultation on the UNFCCC COP28 to unpack the SA negotiating position to the COP. Let me firstly apologize to the federations. We have realized that the federations were omitted when we were sending out invitations. We profusely apologize for that. Please note that this is the first round of negotiations on the negotiating position. Do extend the invitation to us when you have activities or events so that we can come and unpack the SA negotiating position to COP28. Colleagues, without much ado, I will now invite the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Ms. Barbara Creecy, to come and deliver her remarks. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon to everybody. Allow me to acknowledge Ms. Nomusa Dube-Ngube, the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, who is with us on the online platform, our Presidential Climate Commissioners, and Dr. Crispin Olver and Ms. Lebogang Mulaisi, who are joining us from the Commission Secretariat. Let me also acknowledge our Chief Negotiator, Mr. Maisela Kekana, who is Deputy Director General of Climate Change and Air Quality. Ms. Retumetse Moletsani, Head of Environment in the National Business Initiative. All of our social partners and stakeholders, as well as members of the media. And let me give a special acknowledgement to those of you who are joining us online. Ladies and gentlemen, before I make my opening remarks, let me just say to you that this afternoon there is a sitting of the National Assembly. When the bells are rung for voting, I will sneak out to vote. So I hope you will all understand. If you do see somebody wave to me and I duck out, it's not because I don't like your contribution. But I must go and vote in the National Assembly. And then, of course, I'll come back. It is a great honor to be delivering these opening remarks at our National Stakeholder Consultation on COP28. And when I was preparing these remarks, I thought back to just over 4 years ago when I presented my first remarks before, I think at that time it was COP26 that took place in Madrid. And at that time I shared with you that there were things that we were going to do during this term of government. I said that we would set up the Presidential Climate Commission. I said we will put the climate bill through the National Assembly. I said we would make progress with regard to our mitigation and adaptation architecture. And I'm pleased to say that we have done most of those things that I told you we would do 4 years ago. I'm particularly excited because on Tuesday, the climate bill was passed by the National Assembly. It's now going to the National Council of Provinces for concurrence. And then, of course, if we receive that concurrence, it will be signed into law. And it was also exciting during that debate that many parties in the National Assembly supported that bill. I think there were only 2 parties that didn't support of all the parties represented in the National Assembly. And I felt during the course of that debate that it really indicated the extent to which climate change has become something that many, many citizens in our country are aware of, and many political parties believe is an issue that it is important to take seriously. Now, COP28 it's an important milestone because this conference takes place exactly halfway between the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2016 and the UN's 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. And we know that 2030 is regarded by scientists in the climate change space as being a critical milestone. And so it's going to be an important opportunity for the global community to take stock on the progress we have made since the signing of the Paris Agreement, and an important opportunity to reaffirm commitment to the Paris Agreement and to take collective action to accelerate mitigation, adaptation, and financing for further climate ambition. Now, we know that this particular COP comes at a time when the world as a whole is starting to grapple with the impact of climate change on daily life. And we have seen, very sadly, the enormous impact that climate change is starting to have on our own continent. The devastating drought in the Horn of Africa, the flooding that our country and many of our neighboring countries have experienced over the last couple of years, devastating wildfires that are currently taking place across our own country. And what we know is that because our continent is not adequately building climate resilience, we're already substantially moving into the area of loss and damage. And at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the big victory, I think, for developing countries was the formation of the Loss and Damage Fund. But of course, what we know is that exactly how it will be financed, where the finance will come from, what the form of the finance will be, who will qualify to receive that financial support. Those are issues that will still be important agenda items at COP28. As with all COPs, the question of finance, therefore, is going to remain very central to the agenda. And what we are going to see is renewed pressure from developing countries that historical pledges by developed countries must be met, but also that we have to start to address the urgent issue of how the post-2024 global financial architecture for climate change, what it's going to look like, and whether or not there are going to be new and predictable grant sources of financing. At COP27, our delegation, together with the African continent, put forward a proposal to include the special needs and circumstances of our continent. What are those special needs and circumstances? The African continent has historically only contributed 2% to the buildup of global emissions that are causing the current climate crisis. And yet, as I have already indicated, our country is still being severely affected. Acknowledging the special circumstances of the African continent is an important step in upholding the principle of differentiated responsibility and would recognize our continent's vulnerability to climate change and the need for more adaptation and mitigation support. Significantly, the first global stocktake will be completed at COP28. And this is an opportunity for the world to look backwards and to assess what progress we have made in meeting the terms and conditions that we adopted in Paris. But it's also an opportunity for us to look forward and to decide how we need to improve ambition going forward. Now, we already know, because the technical report has already come out, we already know that we are not on track. And we know that much more is needed to be done if we are to achieve the goals that science tells us are so necessary. Interestingly, what the technical report indicated is that the world is better off than it would have been without the Paris Agreement and without the multilateral cooperation that has been generated by the existence of the Paris Agreement. But that doesn't mean that we're on track to meet the goals we agreed on in Paris. The discussions on the outcomes of the global stocktake have started, and they have focused on key political messages, and more importantly, on multilateral and national measures that need to be put in place to accelerate our journey towards a more sustainable and equitable world. As you know, I am, together with my Danish counterparts, one of the co-facilitators of the political phase of the global stocktake. And in this regard, we are supporting the incoming Emirati COP presidency to help identify areas of convergence and divergence between parties in the run-up and during COP28. At the past 3 COPs, the South African delegation has joined delegations from other developing countries in calling for a clear adaptation work program with clear targets for building the resilience of developing countries and clear financial mechanisms to achieve this. To date, there has not been substantial progress on this matter. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa remains fully committed to addressing climate change based on science, equity, and in the context of sustainable development. Hence, our updated NDC seeks to balance the 3 structural components of mitigation, adaptation, and the need for international support for implementation. I think it's important just to indicate to you that COP28 also provides a key platform for broader conversations. And I think some of the 3 important broader conversations will be taking place on the margins of COP28. The first is how developing countries in Africa can take advantage of their abundant renewable energy resources and strategic minerals to build shared prosperity and sustainable development on the continent. The second is the threat to sustainable development posed by unilateral trade measures imposed outside of the Paris Agreement and in violation of the key principles of the Paris Agreement. And in particular here, I think we are highlighting these measures known as CBAM. And the third issue that I think will receive a lot of attention is the pressing need for transformation of the global financial architecture to make the global financial system fit for purpose in assisting countries to combat climate change and also to achieve their sustainable development goals. Our president is on record for arguing that no country should have to choose between climate action and achieving the sustainable development goals. Ladies and gentlemen, with these few opening remarks, I think that it will be important to hand over to Mr. Kekana, who will be giving you the nitty-gritties of our negotiating position as approved by our cabinet last week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Warm greetings to you and to the climate commissioners. I saw a number of them in the room, and the Executive Secretary, Dr. Olva, representing the Presidential Commission. I understand that we have Premier of KZN on the line. Warm greetings to you. But warm greetings to everyone who is tuning in to these consultations. I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. The screen is behind me, but let's see how it goes. For those that have been to the COP, they would know how intense it is at the COP. But that is simply because there is just too many bodies of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting. And you have the COP, the COP itself. It's got its own, there's certain agenda items that are directly under the COP, and these are mainly the finance agenda items. But you also have the Kyoto Protocol, so the meeting of the parties is also taking place. Then you've got the meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement taking place at the same time. And these are agenda items. When you see these bodies, just see agenda items under each. Of course, before those three meet in the second week, during the first week, you've got the two permanent subsidiary bodies that do quite a lot of work. As sent to them by those three bodies. So the subsidiary body for implementation would be meeting. I think there's about 26, 27 agenda items there. And you've got subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice during that first week. So the first week, very intense because you've got these two bodies meeting, and the agenda for that is quite heavy. So that is the organization. We all know that COP28 is said to be the crunch moment, simply because science is telling all of us that we need to ramp up our action. But there is, as we all know, there's increased geopolitical tensions, and we are also subjected to these discussions on carbon border adjustment measures, where There's a potential of reversal of climate finance from developing to developed countries, because our products will then be liable for those border adjustment taxes. So in essence, we will be funding the developed countries, which is why this is very contentious and opposed by all of us in the developing countries. At the same time, we are facing scarce resources, especially for us in the developing countries. But at the same time, we need to ensure that there's no backtracking. We have to move forward, especially around the issues of finance support to developing countries. So what are the general expectations? We expect that the COP itself, or how the UAE, United Arab Emirates, structured a COP, there will be the summit, just like we had in the last two previous COPs. This is a summit of heads of states. So on the first and the second, it will be a meeting of heads of states. Of course, we will open the COP on the last day of November to adopt the agendas, and we will pause for the summit for the heads of states so that they can provide some momentum to the negotiations, give guidance, and also progress and ambition across all the pillars. So there will be various roundtables, various discussions, a lot of bilaterals in between. So these 2 days of the summit are quite busy days. Last year, our president was chairing the roundtables, particularly on the just transitions and finances. So we can already expect that the 1st and the 2nd of December will be quite busy. The president will be attending as invited by the COP president. Let's see. Oh, okay. Yeah, this I can point in that direction. That would help. And this is really our position as outlined by the minister. As many of you would know, we do not negotiate in isolation. We are part of a bigger bloc called the Africa Group. So we negotiate as part of the group, which is led by ministers of environment, or what people usually refer to as AMSEN. So the ministers, leaders as negotiators under the Africa bloc. Minister has already indicated how important COP28 is, because this is where we need to correct whatever did not quite work out. So course correct is the name of the game in COP28 through this global stock take. It has to, the outcomes of this global stock take or stake has to inform our next plans, what we call the nationally determined contribution, or NDCs, that countries will be submitting in 2025. So the outcome of that global stock takes are quite important to inform national plans. And this is important because if science is telling us that we are not on track to meet all the objectives of the convention, so it means we have to do something, and that has to show in our subsequent plans, these NDCs. I will not dwell much into the next one. Minister has already said we are assisting the COP presidents together with the minister from Denmark on that particular point of taking stock. For us, it's also important because it is widely acknowledged that we need more than public finance, but we need the bodies that are providing this finance to be fit for purpose, as they were initially not set out to deal with climate change. So that reform of multilateral development banks is quite important so that they can be fit for purpose, and there's work already underway. Of course, there's big issues around loss and damage. Last year, we agreed to establish this fund. So the whole year, we've been working towards that particular goal, and we want to see this concluded. Not only that, but also perhaps money also starting to flow into that particular fund. And last year was also a milestone because we agreed to have a dedicated work program on reducing greenhouse gas emissions through this mitigation work program. So it will be the first time we take decisions under that particular work program solely dedicated to mitigation. We also launched the Just Transition work program. This is a little bit behind, so we at the COP, we just need to agree to the modalities of that particular work program. Right, it worked. On adaptation, which is a key priority for not only for South Africa, but also for the continent. We are busy doing work under what we call the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on global goal for adaptation. So we want to see tangible outcomes there. We do not have targets, believe it or not, for adaptation or adapting to these impacts of climate change. We do not have agreed indicators. So that will be the big work for us during the COP. There's also the issue of doubling financing for adaptation. Last year, the African continent proposed an agenda item to deal with that particular issue, but it did not fly. So we'll try again this year. Of course, we need to ensure that there's support flowing from developed to developing countries, not what CBAM wants to do to reverse that particular flow. And we want to ensure that there's universal access to multilateral hazard early warning system. And this is the point that is also being championed by the UN Secretary General through the program that he launched last year. And I've already said a lot about loss and damage. Besides finalizing the work of the Transitional Committee, we also need to look at the technical aspects of loss and damage, which is called the Santiago Network. We need to find the proper home for this network. We also need to have the secretariat for that particular network. And this is important because the network will help us to quantify some of these losses and damages as they occur. After that, we will have to make sure that there's resources from the loss and damage fund and the funding arrangements, which is also going to be key at this COP. The mitigation work program is very important to many of us. As you know, mitigation is the first line of defense. If you do not have enough mitigation, your adaptation costs are quite significant. And if you do not have adequate adaptation measures, then you go into losses and damages. So mitigation work program for us is quite important, and we do not want to see any backtracking there. We want to see a push to accelerate the reduction of this greenhouse gas emission, particularly from the developed countries that the Paris Agreement clearly indicate that they should take the lead on this. Global stocktake, we've already said quite a lot on it. Let's just save time there. Let's see. It doesn't want me to deal with finance. It skips because this is highly contentious. As you know, there's been pledges since 2009 of about 100 billion from developed countries to developing countries. That pledge has not yet been fulfilled. So it is quite important that we receive a presentation on that to see what's really going on there. We need also under this agenda item where we are negotiating a new goal on finance. The 100 billion expires next year. So by 2025, we should have concluded the negotiations for a new goal. And our view is that the new goal needs to be based on the needs of developing countries, because the 100 billion goal just dropped from the sky, as you know, is completely inadequate to meet our needs. So that negotiation is really important, but fulfilling the previous goal of 100 billion is quite important, because it's a trust building exercise. We know when people pledge, then they will fulfill that. For as long as that goal is not fulfilled, a trust deficit continues to be lagging there. So those are the issues on finance. On the just transition, this is a new work program. There's a real problem here because when we agreed to a just transition work program, we did not quite agree on what would be the scope for that. So concluding these modalities is quite important. Our position as the developing countries as a whole is very clear that we need to look at this issue in its totality, not one aspect of it, which seems to be the view from the other side, that we only need to look at the workforce, but just transition, as you know, in South Africa, it affects everyone. And our approach, and the Climate Commission will talk more about that. Our approach is broader than that. It's a whole society approach. So we need to agree the kind of modalities and the engagements that we need to have. But what we've also seen that seems to be disturbing is that some countries are trying to take the opportunity to reverse the differentiation that exists in the system. The differentiation is very important because we know who should lead, who should provide support, and what is the journey for us as developing countries moving forward. So we've seen people trying to reverse some of those through the negotiation of this just transition. So that we will be dealing with that issue as well. In conclusion, it is quite urgent that we enhance the international cooperation. We all know that even if South Africa was to emit zero emissions today, we will still be impacted if everybody else is still not reducing their emissions. So international cooperation and solidarity is quite important. So the issues of providing resources to middle-income countries such as South Africa to do their own action is also important, and the issues of providing resources for least developed countries, the small islands, developing states, to deal with these losses and damages and build resilience and adaptive capacity, quite critical. So COP28 will be very important to all of us. We need to see a massively scaled up, new quantified long-term goal finance. We need to see progress in those discussion, and we need to see a clear roadmap for the implementation of the new goal on finance. The global stocktake outcome is central, as I've already indicated, but it should be based on equity and best available science. And this is where maybe I should pause a little bit. You might have seen there's a lot of targets that are being put on the table that we need to agree to these sort of targets. and these are coming from certain other bodies. But the space for the international negotiation really is to then zoom into those targets and say, what is the equity around those particular targets that are being put on the place, in place? What is the equity there? Who should be leading what? Who should be supporting who? So just having targets in a vacuum, they are not going to be helpful. We need to have this sort of negotiations around those particular targets. And that is the function of a multilateral system. So equity and the best available science remains as our guide as we continue these engagements. And the other issue there, the multilateral agreements on financing for just transition, this is very important, and this is the cornerstone of our position under the Just Transition Work Program, because as you know right now, there's various just energy transition all over the place with different resources, and these are not multilaterally agreed or negotiated. So our partners can pick and choose how much they give you, how much they give me. So we want to have clear agreements on how these things should be funded. Ideally, we should have a dedicated financing for this just transition. So the multilateral engagement on the just transition is quite critical so that we can safeguard even those that do not have these particular plans. It is important that we continue with those negotiations. So we stand ready as usual to play our constructive roles, and our minister, as you've already heard, will be assisting in terms of the facilitation of this global stocktake. But we also have a number of negotiators assisting in various agenda items in terms of facilitation to reach agreements there. We also have a number of our theme negotiators also leading whether a segment in the Africa group on a particular issue, or whether in the G77 itself on a particular issue. So our delegation stand ready to play a meaningful role in these negotiations. And this is where I will stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chief Negotiator. We are now going to listen to the voices of our stakeholders. We have allocated 10 minutes per stakeholder. We'll start with the representative of the youth. I will call upon Ms. Kopano Moraka to come to the fore. So all presentations are going to be shared after this session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can I just check what take? I pressed the middle button, right? Okay. Okay, perfect. Good afternoon. I hope we're all well. I'm going to, sorry. I'm going to start off by saying that I think in the lead towards this year's global stocktake, it is important to uphold the principles of equity, human rights, dignity, and collaborative commitment to accelerate climate action through NDCs to build a self-actualized, climate-resistant, climate-resilient, and prosperous society. Young people all across the country are calling for climate justice and equity to underpin all action towards addressing the climate crisis, whilst championing the need for a swift and equitable just transition that shifts away from highly centralized production dependent on fossil fuel towards decarbonized and decentralized renewable energy. I think first and foremost, we applaud all respective efforts towards the passing of the climate change bill by DFFE and the National and the NPA, and entrust that it will translate into actionable commitment towards fostering a low carbon economy in South Africa. Two, We urge that the global stocktake outcome should reflect the need to transform food systems for climate change adaptation and mitigation, with a critical need for food transition through adequate permaculture, smart agroecology methods, and land cultivation to address food insecurity through the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation Initiative launched at COP27. 3, financial mobilization and investment into green solutions for water filtering and water reclamation technologies is encouraged to enhance service delivery within water-scarce community following this year's UN Water Conference in New York. 4, we note, I think with grave concern, that climate financing is exacerbating the debt burdens of developing nations, and thus we call for the commitment to source $100 billion per year in climate finance by the developed countries, as outlined in the Paris Agreement, to be met rapidly. 5th, we advocate for the increased support for women and vulnerable communities, equal and meaningful participation in health, sustainable development, and climate policymaking inclusive mechanisms for implementation and monitoring goals set out in the Paris Agreement. And last but not least, we urge for peace-positive adaptation and conflict-sensitive climate policy, which is aimed to addressing environmental degradation, food insecurity, economic instability as a result of social unrest and forced increasing displaced migrants. I think feeding into the themes identified by the COP28 president on fast-tracking the transition to a low carbon and delivering on agreed upon climate finance, building on a people's approach to the goals set out by the Paris Agreement with full inclusivity and the protection of livelihoods, my plans to COP28 as one of the 100 Youth International Climate Delegates is to advocate for and to reinforce the inclusion and the implementation of the first ever South African Youth Climate Action Plan as a youth-led guide that aims to inform South Africa's climate policy under the pillars of intersectionality, advocacy and activism, good governance, systemic transformation, and environmental sustainability. I also aim to follow up and contribute input on operationalizing climate finance related commitments such as the Loss and Damage Fund, pledges towards South Africa's now $11.8 billion Just Transition Investment Plan, which was announced now on the 29th of September. Peace and conflict-driven policies aimed at protecting communities' indigenous livelihoods. And last but not least, the investment on food innovation and scaling up of farmers in climate-smart agriculture. And I also aim to co-host and moderate an educational and awareness side event at the Children and Youth Pavilion on the 9th of December to demonstrate the role that art, social media, and technology can play in youth advocacy and climate policy. My expectations to COP, and I hope this also resonates with most of South African youth, are to, I guess, for one, advocate that member states have an honest and concise conversation about the opportunities and possible cautions pertaining to the continent's position on carbon credit markets, as well as the adaptation, as well as the adequate implementation of climate policies. I also expect positive agreement towards reforming and modernizing the global financial system architecture between multilateral development banks, making it fit for purpose to support sustainable development, as per President Ramaphosa emphasized in last year's COP27. And lastly, I expect effective devising of a monitoring and evaluation system on the global goal on adaptation to be enhanced to strengthening mitigation resilience and reduce vulnerability in climate change. I think overall, as young people, we applaud the South African government and their unwavering strides to increasing youth involvement in international climate meetings by adopting youth delegates to COP and other conferences. I can attest to that, and yes. Furthermore, we urge that support be given continuously and I guess taking lessons from COP28 and Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, and recent initiatives like the COP28 presidency, International Youth Climate Action Delegate, which I'm a part of. And now to end things off, I am going to now officially like to hand over to the Youth at SIAP team, the official statement to the official South African Youth Statement to COP28 that was done by the Climate Change Working Group under the Youth Policy Committee, which I think demonstrates our commitment as young people towards a cleaner and greener world for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kopano. We'll now call upon the representative from Labour, Mr. Melisizwe Kiso.
Oh, there's no presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting us to this engagement here today. So I just wanted to firstly deal with the issue of the process of how we find ourselves here. You know, I've been attending the meetings called by the Department of Environmental Affairs for a number of years. And I've always felt that, you know what, this department is an example to other departments in terms of consultation. And there's a lot that the other departments could learn in terms of meaningful consultation. However, in the past couple of years, the issue of consultation or the consultations have started to feel like tick box exercises. And, you know, I think it's quite important that, you know, just to make an example, that last year's the JET IP and the lack of consultation we found ourselves with a rejection of the JET IP by organized labor by organized labor. So, you know, I would like to just implore or appeal to the department to bring back the spirit of the National Climate Change Commission engagements, which were very well attended by all stakeholders, from labor, civil society, etc. I mean, I'm looking around the room here today, and the room is barely filled, and this is supposed to be a national stakeholder consultation. So I implore the department to bring back that spirit of the national climate change consultations that used to happen. So, you know, when it comes to the negotiations, and when we speak about the COP negotiations, the aspirations that we have as labor, is that, you know, taking from the PCC framework that was released last year, is that, you know, the 3 pillars to achieve a just transition are around distributive justice, restorative justice, as well as procedural justice. And we hope that at the, you know, the discussions around the loss and damage that will be happening at the negotiations this year, we hope that these loss and damage should prioritize the global South. Because it is the global South that is most adversely affected by climate change, in the context where we find ourselves to be having a lot of suffering from the effects of climate change, as well as austerity. There are millions of people who are losing jobs and livelihoods as we currently in terms of the climate change, the effects of climate change that we're experiencing. the early warning systems. We appeal that these early warning systems need to be democratized, and so that people can truly be able to achieve mitigation and adaptation measures when implementing, when these climate change effects affect them. And then when it comes to the issue of financing, you know, as COSATU has developed alternative financing models to achieve the commitments that have been set out or aimed at achieving the goals and targets that the country has set for itself. And we implore again that the government listens or has a proper consultation where all stakeholders' voices are heard, because it is quite strange that we have set all these targets, but we have not been able to, we have put these targets in place, but we have not been able to settle on how we finance the achievement of these targets by 2030, which is in a matter of 6 years from now. So I'm hoping that in these negotiations, we ensure that the livelihoods of people, we know that the livelihoods of people are at the hands of these negotiations, and people's livelihoods are being at the hands of these negotiations. But just to say that we need to ensure that the voices of the people are heard and listened to, because without hearing or listening to the voices of these people who are mostly adversely affected, especially the workers, we will not be able to achieve the justice element in the just transition. It'll just simply be a transition and not a just transition. I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next two speakers are connected virtually. I will take Ms. Shamini Harrington, who's representing business. She will be followed by Mr. Thandolwethu Lukoko, who's representing the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, and afternoon to you all. I hope you can hear me well enough, and apologies for not being able to attend in person. Diaries just didn't accommodate it, but I'm really very happy to be able to share business news here today. I'd like to say a warm greeting to the Minister, the Commission, my fellow commissioners, as well as the Premier, as well as Mr. Kekana. So I've structured my input according to three specific areas: the call for higher ambition, the need for enabling finance, as well as just transition and social impact. So first and foremost, on the issue of higher ambition, BUSA acknowledges the significant global target implementation gap identified in the initial global stocktake. We endorse the call for higher ambition by the UAE COP presidency. However, we believe that the responsibility for greater ambition should rest on parties to the Paris Agreement, in line with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, considering, of course, their natural circumstances and finance needs, as well as the just transition. The business community remains committed to decarbonization and is actively reducing emissions. We are also actively supporting South Africa's ambitious nationally determined contribution. Our aim is to contribute to a just transition and the diversification of the energy mix, whilst also acknowledging the current role of fossil fuels in the energy mix. It's imperative to acknowledge that South Africa's economy is currently fragile, compounded by an ongoing energy security crisis that exacerbates poverty, unemployment, especially among the youth, and inequality. Addressing this triple challenge must be our priority to ensure that people are not left behind. Furthermore, challenging macroeconomic conditions and pressing national priorities are also constraining business. In this context, BUSA finds it challenging to see how further reductions in greenhouse gas emissions beyond our currently committed NDC can be accommodated, given the current economic climate. South Africa's NDC has recently been revised, as has been stated by the department, and it is already ambitious and represents our fair share. It's important to note that the lower end of the range already places South Africa in the select group of developing country contributions that aligns closely with the 1.5 degree target and is also set for 2030. We also support that backsliding from this NDC is not an option. Given the current global economic climate, we advocate for increased flexibility mechanisms for all parties. The role of sustainable forestry management towards carbon sequestration and storage and products is recognized nationally and internationally. Constraints to the expansion of the forestry value chain must be unlocked to expand this opportunity. In addition, there should also be an emphasis on nature-based solutions and the development of high-quality offset credits that contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I will now move to the need for enabling finance. While BUSA wholeheartedly endorses that developed economies should provide financial, technological, and capacity-building assistance to developing economies during their transition, we stress that this support should not lead to an increased financial burden or impose unwanted or unwarranted conditions on these developing economies. Most crucially, climate finance should not add to South Africa's current debt burden. Regrettably, climate finance flows have thus been insufficient and non-additional, placing relative costs of climate change disproportionately on the shoulders of developing economies. This is happening despite their limited fiscal capacity, which hinders sustainable development. The recent proposals for cross-border tax adjustments could be used to fund developed country climate financing obligations, and in our view is perverse, and it is not in line with the Paris Agreement. From a BUSA perspective, we agree that if international financing is to be agreed upon, it must be concessional in nature, primarily grant-based, and free of conditionalities. This approach will allow countries like South Africa to launch beneficial projects and attract private sector funding for the nation's benefit. BUSA welcomes the inclusion of the just transition in the Global Stocktake report. However, we believe that the just aspect of the transition has not received sufficient international attention. It is imperative to recognize that South Africa is uniquely positioned to shape and define what a just transition means for our country. We must ensure that it aligns with our national interests, development goals, and the ability to access finance that is consistent with our transition pathways. In addition, as we transition, flexibility is needed, with focus directed to recognizing the vulnerability and challenges we face as a nation, including within business and especially for small, medium, and micro enterprises. When leveraged effectively, this transition can provide opportunities for a low-carbon future that promotes sustainability, inclusivity, and prosperity for us all. It's essential to recognize that South Africa's transition is unique due to its scale and urgency of the national priorities, especially our energy security issues. Furthermore, we call on the government at COP28 to highlight the significance of international partnerships and collaboration. Such alliances can leverage funding, expertise, knowledge, and resources to advance our just transition objectives. We emphasize the importance of both financial and non-financial support mechanisms, taking an economy-wide value chain approach. For instance, when providing financial support for emerging technologies, international financiers and multilateral development banks should facilitate off-takers, de-risk projects, and include market access, considering, of course, affordability. The import of technology should have at its core meaningful and inclusive participation of all stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders, including business, as well as SMMEs, with a view to encourage localization opportunities. This approach not only will accelerate the much-needed revenue for building a future low-carbon economy, but positively assists in local and regional development. A paradigm shift is necessary, shifting the discourse from countries attracting finance to funders making finance available at scale and speed through innovative financing mechanisms. We must emphasize that these principles should be articulated and implemented at an international level as prerequisites for supporting and realizing a just transition. I thank you for your time. Intendo, it's over to you.
Thank you, Shomini. Good afternoon, colleagues and comrades. The name is Thando Lukuka. I'm the coordinator of Climate Action Network South Africa. I will be making a quick submission. Just allow me just to present my screen. And then if I could also just say congratulations to the Minister and her team for getting the climate bill effectively 2 steps away from, or at least a step away from the president's signature. We hope all things are going to go well with the NCOP. All right. Thanks again for the opportunity to just provide some oversight on the COP28. Really what we're going to be engaging on primarily as a civil society body is largely something which I'm going to speak to in a moment, is what we consider a comprehensive energy package, which is a bit of a progression from 26 and 27. And those 2 items, I'm not going to go through all of the bullets, but just to say that it's something that we're proposing that, we recognize firstly that the biggest cause for climate change is fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels. So in this package, one of the things that we need to be clear is moving away from fossil fuels as an imperative. And then the phasing out of fossil fuels should be fair, fast, full, and funded. Some of these points that I'm going to share here have already been touched on by my previous speakers, so I won't go into depth. And then also just to say, we've also got other colleagues on the call who I'm sure will make further detailed inputs on what it is I want to be sharing. The second component to the energy package is then to really scale up RE and energy efficiency. We believe that there is a possibility to move towards 100% RE. We need to. We've got data that shows that we can do that. At the same time, we need to be able to triple the amount of RE capacity that we currently have installed. This is not just looking at South Africa as a country. This is looking at South Africa as a country in terms of its own commitments, but also as a global community working on climate as key things. And then, of course, one of the other key things for us, especially relevant for South Africa as well, is to the expansion of infrastructure, particularly. We make the specification of clean infrastructure because we're talking about infrastructure that really supports RE, so battery storage being one of those key technologies. In terms of just the 100% RE, we know that there's no existing framework, so that framework would need to be put in place. Looking at the principles that have been highlighted there in the bold text, also really emphasizing the reliability and affordability of the energy that is going to be provided from these renewable sources. And then these are just some key elements that we think need to be considered. We live in a continent with 600 million people without access to electricity. We live in a country with great electrification access rates, but affordability is becoming increasingly a problem in this country for several reasons. And so these things need to be factored in as we make this progression towards a just and equitable future for South African citizens. Also important is the transparency, the democratic processes and governance that really control these energy systems. Just to tag the ERA work that's been currently pushed by the other department, I think is very much in line with this, and it really supports this idea of shifting towards a new energy system, particularly for the country, but also for the globe. Also then, if you just talk on financing, although I will have another section that speaks just to the financing components very, very directly. So of course, as was stated by the chief negotiator, that the biggest culprits for where we find ourselves today are the developed nations. Their countries, just by looking at them in many instances, one can understand where climate change comes from, just based on their levels of development compared to ours. And so we need to be able to make this shift. And similarly to the inputs made by Shamini from Busa, is that we need to have financing that allows us to be able to stay specifically within that 1.5 degree pathway, even though some spaces have pushed really that this 1.5 may no longer be feasible and more 1.8 might be necessary. The last thing I wanted to add on this particular slide is just that we need to push up the figure to $1.1 trillion US. There's data that supports this that we will share on the slide once we share it. But to say that a lot of this funding needs to come from a grass-based system, public funds ideally, and then this is on an annual basis at a global level. We do have numbers that will specify it to the continental levels as well. I think there are numbers as well that specify what South Africa specifically would need. We touched on the transforming of the financial system. If I could just draw your attention to the underlying parts, what we know is very clear is that we need a fairer financial system. The Bretton Woods institutions were set up at a time where the so-called global South was not too dominant in global politics, and so that has changed significantly since then. So the architecture needs to change as well. to reflect that. The next point is that if you look, for example, at what we're experiencing with the JETPs, in many countries, including our own, a lot of that financing is not coming in terms of grant, it's coming in as loans. And so, I mean, for indebted countries like not only ourselves, but many others, it needs to kind of shift away from debt financing or heavily debt financing to more grants-based financing, or at least some kind of equivalent to that, or at least equivalent between loans and then your grants to kind of balance the scales, as it were. And then largely, as I said earlier, we definitely need to phase out of coal and fossil fuels generally. And so there needs to be a financial mechanism that allows for that to happen. On Article 2.1c, the definition of what that speaks to is articulated there, but specifically what we would want to see is new and additional grants-based finance, as I said earlier, is a key imperative for us. And then secondly, the actual system itself needs to be transformed to make more action more affordable for specifically developing countries. Key interventions there that could be explored that we've also expounded on a little bit further is opportunities in terms of debt, so debt forgiveness, for example, taxation, there's opportunities for taxing the wealth, there's debates ongoing around that. And then of course, technology transfer is a key thing here because as we know, most of these technologies are not available in the country. As we heard on LND, definitely a milestone moment that happened at COP27. We recognize as well the work that South Africa is doing as a country in its co-lead responsibility at the TC, at the Transitional Committee, and also the challenges that the TC is currently going through just to try and find alignment on some of these issues. Some of the key things that we're looking out for is just the issues of access, how much, for instance, communities or other bodies that are not necessarily a state entity would have access to those funds. Let's say if we take again an example of Durban, would municipality of Durban, for example, or other organizations have access to those funding? How much of that funding will be able to really recover, for example, the damages that we witnessed in a place like Durban? Is the financing additional? So we're not repackaging and renaming existing funding and saying that it's something new. Instead, we're really finding new and innovative ways of finding this money. And then, of course, the key one is accountability, because we know that the issues of transparency sometimes really, really do leak. And when they do, they undermine the progress that we can make as a global community. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but just to say, in terms of some key principles, that financing and the fund itself is going to be timely, flexible, predictable, multi-year funding support for both rapid onset and slow onset impacts. Because, I mean, one can plan for this. We know that both of these are happening at differential rates. So to some extent, the fund, once established, has got to be able to respond to both slow onset and rapid onset measures. Yeah, let's move on from there. This one kind of touches a little bit again on this thing of the accountability and not repackaging, particularly ODA as new finance. Unfortunately, when we talk about the subject of finance within the UNFCCC parlance, there's multiple streams, and a lot of them have very much the same principles. And so even in this particular one, we would like to see that funding that has been committed to is not just, again, repackaged or just double counting just to say that the country has done more than it actually has. And then on GGA, for us, it's just a clear work plan on how to fully operationalize it. Some key elements would be clarity on the definitions, collective progress, indicators for diversity, what does diversity mean, and how we want to measure it. The input for adaptation finance needs, we know that adaptation finance is significantly lesser than what we get for mitigation. So what kind of mechanism, including what the NCQG is discussing at the moment, is available? Tracking and assessing of the existing commitments. Sometimes we might have a fairly good idea of the financial flows, but in many instances, particularly now for again, GGA as a new subject, if you will, excuse the language, we need to be able to track that as well and see that the finance that was earmarked is doing what it was intended to do. And then lastly, on this particular issue would be a proposal to have a permanent agenda item within the CMA and SPs at COP28 for the subject of GGA. On GST, we've just got these three bold points. GST shouldn't be limited, or at least in our thinking, to just COP28. It should be something that should be considered, especially the outcomes and recommendations for how they're going to be implemented in the coming years. The second thing is GST must be there must be a clear guidance, all right, on how ratcheting is going to take place, particularly, as I said, the NDCs are coming up to an end in 2023 and 2030, sorry. And so when those get revised, there must be some kind of guidance on how we're going to make sure that ratcheting takes place by all countries, all parties. And then lastly, finance and enhanced international cooperation, critical enablers for strengthened climate action, which I think speaks for itself. Lastly, on NWP, I'm not going to go through all of them, just some selective ones. I would say, the ambition is not the only target. It's not only about targets, but it's also about implementation. And then the recommendations that come out of there should really focus on how actionable they are, right? Because what's the point of making a plan and you can't implement it? The pledges need to be more of a voluntary nature, but then also rather than real targets that can be measured, reported, and verified. And then just again, I'll touch on the NDC cycles to strengthen it and strengthen the ambition as well, including the element of the roadmap for implementation. And then some of these other points have been made by the previous speakers, so I will not lament on those. The last point I want to add, though, is this last one, which is, in our view, as a sector, the following is a distraction: CCS, carbon capture and storage, geoengineering, and co-firing with other elements. All of those are what we think are distractions because they don't take away from the core cause of what climate change, or what brought about climate change. And so we need to be able to move away from those and actually deal with the cause and not the symptoms only of climate change. Thank you. I know there's a lot that I might have glossed over, but I will leave the rest to some of my other colleagues in the question and answer session to fill in the blanks, as it were. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I will now invite Ms. Lebogang Moloisi, the COO of the PCC, to come to talk about the PCC COP28 program and key messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I'd just quickly like to acknowledge the Minister and your team from DFFE. I'd like to acknowledge the PCC, its Secretariat, as well as all the commissioners present here and also online. I heard that we do have the Premier of KZN on the line. I do acknowledge her presence here, as well as all of the participants that are here today, stakeholders, as well as the social partners from the youth, labor, business, as well as civil society. Program Director, I will admit, it's good that Melisizwe is very quick on his feet, because when you asked for a representative from labor, I almost stood up. But yeah, talking about a just transition, transitions are happening all the time. So I've been tasked with doing something quite simple here today, but just to communicate some of the key messages that are coming from the Presidential Climate Commission in terms of some of the key takeaways from the Commission, as well as just some messaging that is very much informed by the Just Transition Framework that all the colleagues in the room have already been talking about. This is our common framing for a just transition for South Africa. And maybe just to also, in addition, congratulate the Minister, your team, the DFFE for the progress made on the climate change bill. I think this is an important piece of legislation, particularly for the PCC, because now it establishes us in law. We are no longer a figment of someone's imagination. And it goes a long way in also doing the work of the just transition and to make sure that there's continuity from this administration to the next. Just to say that the just transition is central to all climate action in South Africa. I think we've heard a lot about this today, and has become a growing imperative nationally and internationally. The synthesis report by the co-facilitators on the technical dialogue on the global stocktake this past September highlights the just transition as a key outcome of the discussion. First, just transitions can support more robust and equitable mitigation outcomes with tailored approaches addressing different contexts. Second, economic diversification is recognized as a key strategy to address negative impacts of response measures and promote positive synergies. The just transition is situated centrally throughout the synthesis report, highlighted in the context of reaching mid-century goals in mobilizing finance and in implementing ambitious climate action. We are encouraged by the growing momentum to situate just transition strongly in the UNFCCC processes. For the first time at COP26 in November 2021, parties reflected the importance of just transitions to net zero emissions in the final decision text, as well as the provision of adequate climate finance to support these transitions. The call was underscored at COP27 with just transitions linked to implementation and achieving of net zero emissions and finance. The emerging just transition partnerships around the world also illustrate the growing momentum towards the amalgamation of climate ambition and climate finance, with the central imperative of equity. At the Bonn Intersessionals this past June, parties adopted a new work program on just transition pathways, offering a further opportunity to strengthen international cooperation on just transitions. Indeed, our work at the Presidential Climate Commission shows that while just transitions are nationally driven agendas, international cooperation can play an important role in sharing experiences and mobilizing additional financial resources towards developing countries. We appreciate our exchanges with countries all across the world and see many of our peers, both developed and developing, wrestling with very similar issues around the pace of decarbonization, the ways to embody justice in the change, and securing finance in the transition. These types of exchanges can be strengthened in the new UNFCCC work program on just transition pathways, which we will definitely support. Looking ahead to COP28, I would like to highlight two significant agenda items as bearing for us as the PCC. Firstly, being the global stocktake and the adaptation and loss and damage agenda. First, the global stocktake marks a significant accountability moment for climate action, shining a spotlight on whether countries are collectively doing enough to reduce emissions, build resilience, and increase financial flows from developed to developing countries. We must use the moment to double down on our own efforts and call on other countries to do the same. Second, we will need to advance action on adaptation and loss and damage. And I think this theme has been recurring in a number of inputs. Climate change is exacerbating extreme weather events and intensifying floods, storms, and droughts, with many of the worst impacts being felt here in Africa. Africa is warming more and at a faster rate than the global average, despite the continent being responsible for less than 3% of the world's energy-related emissions and just 70% of global cumulative emissions. Wealthy countries will need to drastically scale up finance to support climate vulnerable countries in withstanding and recovering from climate-driven floods, droughts, heat waves, and more. Given the global economic consequences of this impact, it's deeply in their interest to act and to act urgently. Countries will also need to reach consensus to operationalize the loss and damage fund at COP28 and broader funding arrangements with finance that is new, additional, predictable, accessible, adequate, and rapid. Developed countries must demonstrate that they will make good on their commitments to climate vulnerable nations to double finance for adaptation by 2025, including channeling more resources and decision-making power to subnational governments and local communities. I heard Tando in his presentation, he's proposing that we should be asking for $1 trillion US. So I hope the negotiators were listening to that. Yeah, gasp in the room. And countries must adopt an actionable plan for the global goal on adaptation, including agreeing on an ambitious set of targets for adaptation action all across the world, and especially for vulnerable countries within the African context. With those words said, Program Director, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, COO. We are now moving to the next item on questions and discussion. I will invite Minister to come to the table in the front. She will be joined by Ms. Mulaisi, the Chief Negotiator, as well as the Executive Director, Dr. Oliver. Thank you. So I am going to take first round of questions from the room. Then we will allow responses. After the first round, I will then move to the colleagues connected virtually so that we also give them a chance to pose questions. I'll request colleagues to assist with the roving mics. I am going to start in the middle. Yes. Colleagues, please introduce yourselves, the organization that you represent before you pose your question. I will start in the middle. We can start in the middle. Then I'll take the first two hands in the middle. Then we'll move to the row on the left-hand side.
Hi, everybody. Gillian Hamilton, and I'm with civil society members from Africa. There are two questions from an international perspective I'm just trying to understand. So what are the main sticking points for the negotiations internationally? And then where can civil society support South Africa and AMCEN? And then I didn't totally understand or hear the positions from South Africa on some of the key issues. So where do we stand on the question of expanding the donor base? What about the working group on agriculture? We hear there's something that's sticking there at the moment. Where does South Africa stand on taxes to expand funding? And where do we stand on fossil fuel phase out? Those are my main questions.
Thank you. You may come.
My name is Sunny Morgan, and I'm one of the founders of a global movement called Debt for Climate. I've listened to the minister and the DG, the chief negotiator, and the minister used the word climate science 4 times and the negotiator 3 times. So my question to the delegation representing South Africa: how can you trust that you will operate in the best interests of the country when you recently provided Total Energy with a license that says they can continue to extract fossil fuels? That's absolutely ignoring the climate science. More so in the minister's response to the license, 144 pages of ignoring the climate science. When you are going to be representing the interests of the continent, we need to be able to trust that you'll act in the best interest. And I'm afraid your words do not match your actions.
Thank you. There's a hand at the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Dora Margaret. I'm from the South African Local Government Association. I just want to raise 2 points. I think the first one is just in terms of the role when we are working on this position. Minister, I think you'll agree with me that there's something that is missing. We are about to sign the climate change bill into a law, and a huge part of it has got strong implications for local government. It is where the rubber is the road. You will never meet a place which is not a municipality, which is a province or nation. And my view is that how can we be able to consolidate and say, South Africa, we're going to the UNFCCC COP28 without really involving those that are closest to people, to the communities, where the rubber is the road. Those people are supposed to translate the NDCs into the NDCs. And I stand here because even last year, I just feel that local government is being left out, and we are struggling as SALGA to be able to sell this concept of the transition. And I think if we work together, we can be able to achieve better. And I appeal to you that on the eve of signing the climate change bill into a law, we need to center our responses and our positions around local government. I think if we do that, we can be able to go very far, because municipalities have got a role to play, a very serious role on both mitigation, adaptation, and building resilient communities. As you said yourself in your opening statement, that we are already suffering the impact of climate change. Municipalities are barely coping. And I think it's important that we do not leave them behind into this process. So I'm grateful that we're working on the local government support program with the DNDP, but I would like to see it translate into some real actions when it comes into the global issues or in the international negotiations, because we are working very well together with your department. Mobilized local government a couple of weeks ago to really understand what are some of the burning issues. And I think one of the areas is this area around the losses, the damages that municipalities are suffering, a lot alongside their own communities where there is no cover for them. And as a result, we've got a very serious interest in the loss and damage fund in terms of how the architecture of it will it be accessible to local government, same as communities. So the issue around direct access, I believe, is something that we should build into the architecture of the loss and damage fund. And then obviously the ambitiousness of the contribution that have to go. Because I think if it's built at the global level, the direct access component will be probably easier when it comes to the national arena for municipalities and communities to have direct access to that fund that they're really, really desperate for. And I think it's going to assist us in making sure municipalities are not rebuilding business as usual. That they can be able to access additional funds that would be able to assist them not to rebuild the bridge the same way that it was before it was damaged. That there will be additional assistance that could come in where we really could be able to bring in the expertise that is required to rethink how infrastructure is being built in such a way that is resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take 2 more hands from the left. Colleagues, let's be brief and straightforward so that we give each other chance. There are others who are still waiting online, who are still willing to pose questions.
Julia, living conservation South Africa. I just want to commend everyone for your very intelligent negotiating position, both government and civil society. I can't fault the science, I can't fault the approach, but the tone is really, I'm really struggling. South Africa is used to negotiating from a position of strength, and we are shifting negotiating from a position where we are being. People don't sign checks because they have to. They sign checks because they want to. And as South Africa, we have a lot that we can offer into this forum. We know about energy crisis and what it means for a country. We know about the value of nature, which is something that Africa has in abundance that the rest of the world doesn't have. So all I would like to ask the team, take your position, but if you really want to see a change in the investment strategy, we need to be able to shift to firing investment, not begging for it. Nobody is going to give us money because they have to. They will give us money if they want to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica, and I'm the head delegate of the South African delegation for the G20 Youth Summit. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone for their contributions in sharing South Africa's position for the COP28 negotiation process. So my question is, I would like to know what process does South Africa follow in selecting youth delegates to represent African youth voices at COP, more specifically at COP28? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister, we may respond to the first few questions.
No. Let me give Mr. Kukana back on some of the questions. Because some of them relate to the details of the negotiating question. For example, yes, Mr. Kukana is going to start and he'll speak from the podium.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the last question. Very important about the youth and the processes that we follow to select the youth. As many of you might know, we've been taking youth to these conferences for a number of years. Of course, as the department, we do not select any youth. The process that is followed is that we partner with vets, yes, that part of vets that run youth competitions, mock negotiations, and then the top negotiators year in, year out, it's what we get. So we get the best of the best, simply because we follow a very open, transparent process that involves all the youth. So that is the process. In terms of the tone, I'm not sure what that question is about. Honestly, inspiring investments, there's nothing I can do about the tone. The only thing that we can do is to put our position there, to stick to the principles, to negotiate from a principle point of view, to make sure that what is in the Paris Agreement is followed through and through, and there's no reversal. But at the same time, we play our part when it comes to fighting climate change. For example, you look at our NDC is 1.5 degree compatible, particularly the lower end of the range. So that is what we do in terms of our part. We will not in any way succumb to this narrative that as developing countries, our sole mandate should be to create an enabling environment and all those things. We need people to fulfill their own targets, their own obligations as per the Paris Agreement, and Africa is very clear on that. That we need to see the developed countries taking the lead. What we are seeing now is a lot of backtracking. What we are seeing now is a lot of goal shifting. And as a country and as a continent, we will not accept that. We will stick to the principle. We will demand justice when it comes to the issue of climate change and climate action. In terms of the question from Salga, I think the colleague herself indicated that we did consult Salga and we had meaningful engagements, and we've been working together with the local government, not only on the negotiations, as she said, but also when it comes to implementation, providing support, ensuring that all our district municipalities have climate change plans, and so forth and so forth. And we keep increasing that particular collaboration. And the issue of loss and damage, you are quite right. Access is quite key. And this is what we've been fighting for quite a long time. And we managed to win some, particularly for the adaptation fund where there's direct access. So for the loss and damage, I just want to tell you that the big push that we are having now is for countries like South Africa, whether they should be eligible to access these funds when they're available. So that is the starting point. But of course, when it comes to direct access, that is key for all of us, and we will ensure that the fund provide such a modality that we have in the adaptation fund. And as you rightly said, or I think this was civil society that mentioned this point, South Africa is leading the transitional committee. We are one of the co-chairs for the design of this fund. Obviously, the issue of direct access is very important, and we'll ensure that the issue is there. In terms of the sticking points, really, it's all about the carbon space that is left. That is what is underpinning everything. What the developing countries, the global south in general, is saying is that we need our fair share to the carbon budget space that is left, which is why the positions start by saying, and the Paris Agreement itself start by saying, the developed countries must take the lead when it comes to the issues of mitigation, when it comes to reaching the net zero emissions. We should see economy-wide targets from that side, and we want to see the net zero from the developed countries being reached sooner than 2050. That would then provide all of us space so that by 2050 we can all be at net zero. So those are the sticking points in terms of what is really at stake when it comes to these negotiations. A fair carbon space to allow developing countries to develop and reduce poverty and inequality. So that is the underpinning interest for all developing countries. In terms of issues such as taxes, I'm not sure which tax we are talking about. We've already said we are completely opposed to carbon border adjustment taxes. So that particular kind of a tax is not something that South Africa or the G77 will accept, as it will reverse the financial flows from developed countries in the other direction. Funds are supposed to come to us, but this sort of taxes, they tend to reverse these particular taxes. We've heard about other taxes that are being proposed in other sectors. Those sectors have their own bodies. For example, in the IMO, there was a tax on maritime, but that was rejected from what I know. So we cannot talk about taxes that are being negotiated in other bodies. And there was the same in the civil aviation, for example, tax on air tickets and all those things, but that is being handled by that particular body. The bodies, of course, provide the report to the UNFCCC process, but that's all that happens with the report. They just report to us, this is what we are doing. These are the sort of issues that are at play, but there's absolutely nothing that the UNFCCC can do about such issues. You did indicate the issue of fossil fuel phase out. You would recall that South Africa, together with many other developing countries, completely rejected this notion of phase out. We advocated for a phase down on these issues, and ultimately, if you look at the Glasgow language, it talks about the phase down on some of these issues. So Phase down, phase out, we still oppose to that, and it's not fair on all of us. The phase down is more gradual, is more in line with the just transition that the Presidential Commission is talking about. I think those are the questions that I could answer, but Minister, perhaps you might want to take some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kakana. Let me start with this question of expanding taxes to finance climate transitions. I think that there was included in the declaration of the Nairobi Climate Summit, there was a proposal to examine the modalities of an international tax on aviation and on shipping. Now, I think that we are happy to examine the modalities on that. What somebody would need to tell me is what is the international legal framework that could enforce that. Because we've already seen a situation where I think it's the aviation industry says, no, they would not be prepared to participate in that. So I suppose that's your problem with the global tax, is that there's no global financial architecture that allows for a global tax. So it would be voluntary. It wouldn't be enforceable. And I suppose that would be the problem with that. I think that the key issue on sticking points has been partially addressed by Mr. Kakana. Because when we talk about climate justice, we obviously talk about justice inside a country. We talk about transgenerational justice, but we also have to talk about justice between the global north and the global south. And I suppose the fundamental sticking points are sticking points around our understanding of that issue. If you look at what the global north is suggesting, even in their proposals with regard to increasing renewable energy components and phasing out of fossil fuels, they're only talking about in the energy space. They're not talking about in the mobility space, and they're not talking about in the industrial space. So they want to impose standards for certain kinds of phase outs and phase downs on developing countries, and they're using that as a smokescreen to hide the fact that the majority of their emissions now are not in the energy generation space. Certainly if you're talking about the European Union. Obviously, if you're talking about the US, it's a different situation. So I suppose that as Mr. Kakana says, where we are starting to get to in the international negotiations is who is going to use the remaining carbon budget. Developing countries are saying we should use the remaining carbon budget because developed countries have managed to secure the prosperity of their citizens on the basis of the climate crisis we're now suffering. And of course, once you get into that question, then there's all kinds of hypocrisy that you're starting to deal with. So I suppose, what do we want civil society to do? We want civil society to expose some of that hypocrisy. You know, I was saying to my colleague, Commissioner, during the presentation from civil society, we need to think carefully about this question of the usage of Indigenous people. I'm not denying that there are Indigenous people, and I'm not denying the rights of Indigenous people. But the question I'm raising is who in the South African context is an indigenous person. Sort of everybody other than me, I would imagine, and people like me. But I have sat in meetings where African people were said not to be indigenous. So do you regard, and so I just want us to think about how are those categories being used in international discourse, and are they being used in an inclusionary way, or are they being used in an exclusionary way? And I think that's just a question that we need to have. If you're saying everybody who lives on the African continent is indigenous, I don't have a problem. If you're saying everybody who lives in Southeast Asia is indigenous. But if you are saying that only people in small island states are indigenous, and only people who were the original inhabitants of the Western Cape are indigenous, then I think we're using those categories for exclusionary rather than inclusionary purposes. So I think we need to think about some of those questions in our debates and in our discourse. Mr. Morgan, I accept that you have a problem with my appeal decision. The reality is that as an appeal authority, I must apply South African law, and I try to do that in a manner that is faithful to the law and in a manner that is even-handed. And I can tell you it's a very difficult thing to be an appeal authority, because what you have to do as an appeal authority is you have to say, these are my individual views, but this is what the law says. And you have to think about how you manage those views in a way that is in line with the law in the country. There's no law in this country that outlaws prospecting for hydrocarbons. If you want a law that will outlaw prospecting for hydrocarbons, and you think that that is important, then that is what you need to be campaigning for. Of course, if you were to discover hydrocarbons, and you would then have to be applying for an environmental license to extract those hydrocarbons, you would then have to do the climate studies. So that, unfortunately, is the position that I find myself in as an appeal authority, is that I must apply the law as it is in an even-handed manner. You know, I always say it's not very nice being a minister. I've discovered in this job, it's not very nice being a judge either. Because you have to apply the law as you have it. Let's talk a little bit about the Salga issue, because I'm a great advocate that what we face in the climate space is a global problem that impacts in different ways locally. And therefore, our climate responses have to be very locally orientated. And I'm also aware that that means that local government has to play an enormous role. And we know that local government is a level of government that is struggling with delivering some of its basic functions, like provision of water and removal of refuse and so on. What we did when we interfaced with the Portfolio Committee on the Climate Bill was we made 2 amendments. The first one was we made a provision for the mobilization of financing for subnational government. And I think that was intended to try and deal with the complexities that local government face that we recognize. The second amendment that we made was about saying that SALGA must be represented on the Climate Commission. And this was something that I personally dug my toes in around, because there was a view from the portfolio committee that no elected politician must serve on the Climate Commission. And I understood that point of view from a point of view that you don't want the work of the commission to be subject to party political influences. But my view was that if you don't allow for SALGA representation, and so we put in a clause that said no elected official, including a councillor, except for representatives of SALGA. Precisely, Dora, because I agree with the points that you're making, that this is going to impact on local government in more than on any other level. I think we take your point about loss and damage. Where we are in the negotiations now is we're still fighting for the rights of middle income countries such as our own to receive loss and damage, because there would be a view that only the least developed countries and the small island states should have access to financing for loss and damage. Julia, I get your point about how you ask for money. I suppose what we're asking you to understand is the international battle around this issue. The Paris Agreement is clear. Developed countries have an obligation. It's not an act of charity. It's not an act of kindness. It's an obligation. They have failed in honoring that obligation. And that is the battle that I think ourselves, together with all other developing countries, are facing. I think the issue on the representation of youth has been covered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I will now move on to the colleagues connected online. I will start with Ms. Nomisa Duwanaga, the Premier of KZN.
Thank you, Chairperson. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Can I greet the Minister and all the commissioners and all the colleagues and the presenters. I'm not going to cover now the point that has already been covered, Minister, about the bill. But just on the second part, I just want to indicate that multi-level governmental cooperation, it's critical, Minister and colleagues, for the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the NDCs. Hence, the call from all ourselves for the ground-up approach or bottom-up approach in the COP preparation, post-COP, and the period in the middle of the NDC. And as a country and as governments, both provincial and local, with our community formations, we need to be part of the meaningful process, not just at the tail end. That is the layer of climate justice that we need to show our people. And myself as the co-chair minister, you know, in the climate group, co-chair of Africa, we have had those discussions even within the Africa group. These matters have been canvassed quite comprehensively. KZN, as you all know, that it's got a climate council where local government, civil society, academics, labor, women, youth, everybody sits in that in that council, and we get an opportunity to discuss quite comprehensively with the civil society and all other formation. The synthesis report on the IPCC sixth assessment report shows that the adaptation planning of governments is poor, or it is regressing as it is. And I believe that this is dangerous, considering the fact that the risk are feared. If you look at the RI5, that tells you then that indeed we are not in the correct trajectory if we are to really get to the bottom of some of the challenges that we are facing. The last but one is just on the voice of the communities or the indigenous people, let me use that language, especially those in the global south, of course. Minister, I want to stress the point and your team, the women, critically, I'm happy to see that the youth is part of the program as well as the civil society, but we need not to remember to single out women's voice. The plight of women in all kinds of calamities, including the climate change, is always the worst. And it is not ironic, Minister, that the venue for this dialogue is at the jail, is at the women's jail. And I would not want to see the women's voice being jailed in this century. So I think we do need to be sensitive to those matters. I think the issues of climate finance, I think they have been covered in the main, but I do want to say that we do render our support to the Presidential Climate Commission as well as to the Minister and your national team and all the participants that will commit their time and resources to the COP28 discussion. However, from our side, Minister, we do believe that there has to be quite a better discussion and collaboration in terms of how we consult one another and get our views together for the progress of our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I recognize the hand of Hugo Kruger. Please introduce yourself. Hugo?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, sorry there. I'm a civil engineer. I am associated with Truth in Energy. We are a group that criticizes public policy and energy. First statement that the minister made very early on regarding droughts in Africa, and I believe she cited Ethiopia and all those places. I want to point out something that's written in the IPCC report. The IPCC has 3 working groups. Only working group 1 is tasked with what is going to be called the physical science of climate change. Working group 2 is climate impacts, and then working group 3 is mitigations and change. So for practical purposes, only working group 1 is scientific, the rest is political. Working group 1 in the appendix, if you actually go there, would say that there is no signal of climate change for the following phenomenon: river floods, heavy precipitation, landslide, drought, severe storms, tropical storms, sand and dust storms, heavy snowfall, ice storms, hail, snow avalanches, coastal flooding, marine heat waves. However, there are for other types of heat waves. So I just want to point out that we are making statements that is far away from what is actually written in the IPCC report. Okay. And this itself is problematic because we are exaggerating the problem of global warming, term I prefer to use. Yes, it is true, according to the IPCC, the Earth is slightly warmer. It's about half a degree over a century, but it is not as extreme, and it does not require an extreme planned economy response, which we are being proposed at the moment. So I'd like to just point that out over there. And then I want to point out that the way this is being represented is religious in nature. The South African Constitution is secular. It makes a separation between religion and state. We cannot make official climate ideology the official state religion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I recognize the hand of Princess Mtambeni. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Minister and everyone else. My name is Princess Mtambeni. Many people call me Princey. I am a founder of a movement called Africa for Nuclear, which aims to promote nuclear as a key contributor to achieving Africa's agenda for sustainable development. I have the first question to the panel. I'm getting worried that we are having a session just for you guys to brief us, but not to take our comment into consideration. Having said that, I have been able to attend COP26 and COP27. I'd like to remind Minister that as soon as we came back from COP26 in Glasgow, what happened with South Africa is that they established PCC and who worked on the JET IP document. But what happened in Europe is that as soon as they left the COP26, they went and put nuclear and gas as part of their green taxonomy, because the fact is there's a nuclear global renaissance. Many countries are building nuclear power plants, and because they have realized that an energy transition that really does not talk about sustainability is not just. And when we speak about the sustainability, we are talking about energy sources that offer base load. And having said that, the study on comparing the carbon emissions of all electricity generation sources, nuclear had the lowest. And that study was done by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in 2022. And the same study said without nuclear power, climate objectives will not be reached. So I would like to see South Africa taking into consideration also such studies, so that at the end, we do not end with an energy transition that is not just. And having said that, I'd like to also say that we have about 140 nuclear reactors in the world currently operating. And that includes our nuclear power plant, which is Koeberg in Cape Town, that offers the cheapest electricity per kilowatt hour. And I think we need to remind each other that. Earlier on, there's a gentleman that spoke about the OECD report. There's another one that was done in 2021, which says the system costs escalate dramatically the more variable renewables you have on the system. And having said that, as you go to COP, Minister, I would like to see you also including nuclear energy as part of the energy transition that is going to achieve just in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I recognize the word of Lekani Mgoza.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thanks. Greetings to everyone. Greetings to the minister. And thanks for all the presentations, especially from my colleague Utando, coordinator of SACEN, for representing us as civil society. Before I get into my two or three questions, I'd like to say that to the minister, we want to respond to the question on who are the indigenous people in South Africa. And I think the way in which we can respond to that, and the PCC, I believe, can also help you with that, because they do know some of the communities. The way in which we can better understand them is to not consider the narrative of the inhabitancy, who inhabited the land first, who came to South Africa first, because that one is dividing our society. But we need to look at who are the indigenous people according to the practices, the way in which people are living, especially in rural areas, in cases of water scarcity, in cases of drought, that affecting different kinds of farming. So I think we can respond to that question. So my question number one is that, if I'm not mistaken, last year South Africa had a position to go to COP27 with a specific figure in terms of the long-term finance, climate finance post 2025. If I'm not mistaken, there was a specific figure that was going to be negotiated. So this time around, I wonder if South Africa does have another figure that is going to be negotiated about the post-2025 climate goal. And the second question is, the minister spoke about the notion that about Africa with special needs and circumstances. We've seen in previous COPs that this notion has been without success. And in my understanding, some of our counterparts in Global South, they don't support it, if I'm not mistaken. So do you guys think that this one will pass this time around? And my last question, this is a little bit outside of UNFCCC, but of course within the climate space internationally. The International Court of Justice has invited the state to file submissions before it on the question of climate change, as per the UN resolution earlier this year. I'm not sure if Mr. Maisela will remember will remember my email. So I just want to find out if South Africa is preparing to file a submission to the International Court of Justice on the question of obligations of state in respect of climate change. Thank you very much.
I recognize the hand of Andy Lemamba.
Thank you very much. Afternoon, everybody. Afternoon to the Minister. My name is Andy Lemlambo from Grassroots for Climate Action. So mine is very short. It's a point for the Chief Negotiator, Mr. Kekani, when you do your submission. So these negotiations as they are going, they have a potential to outlive all of us, everybody in the room, all of us online. So it's very important. Let me give you an example. A child who was born in the year 2000 was not alive when there was the first negotiations of COP. And when the floods happened in KZN, that child died, meaning on the next COP28, on the next negotiations, that child will not be alive. So it's many people. So my submission as part of civil society is that we do not need a COP beyond 2030. Submit that we need a new COP, a COP that will be speaking to implementation, adaptation, and resilience, a COP that will have all the parties to check on each other, to call each other out, to say if there was money, if there was loans, there was grants, what happened? Why are people still dying? Why do we still have all these catastrophes, but people and communities are not resilient enough? So that's my point of submission when you do your submission at COP, Mr. Kekani. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I recognize the hand of Teron Musana. Teron, are you still there? We'll move to the next speaker, Karange.
Hi, thank you. I've added a question in the chat box.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Sorry.
You may come on.
Okay. Thank you so much, and greetings to the Minister and all the panelists, everyone who has presented. Thank you. My name is Lufunoti Chikarange. I'm an advocate of cyber law and a director at Oriza Consulting Enterprise. I just want to start by saying that I have asked a few questions on the Q&A, so I'm hoping that will be addressed. I had hoped that the PCC will present the position to which we are to give inputs. May I then kindly ask the panelists to advise if we do have a position that we are taking to COP28, or if that is yet to be formulated. And if it's yet to be formulated, when are we expected, can we expect to get to see the draft and engage with it? I also would like to congratulate the Honorable Minister on the approval of the bill by National Assembly. I just have a bit of a challenge that South Africa is known to be the best as far as producing legislation is concerned, but we normally have challenges in terms of implementing those. So I want to ask or to be guided in terms of how are we addressing this thorny issue of having legislations that we can implement because we do not have the resources for it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Kekana Crispian and commissioners and the minister and in the present in the room. So I'd like to echo the statements that the youth have made today. I'm with the Youth Policy Committee today, and I do think they have some additional questions in the room. But something that I would like to ask is regarding South Africa's positioning on Article 6.8. Where do we stand? And I'd also like some more information on the African Carbon Markets Initiative and where South Africa is standing on that, especially when we look at the recent Vera scandal that revealed 90% of their carbon credits are junk. And so if we look at the recent case of Liberia conceding 10% of their land to an Emirati company in the name of generating carbon credits. And this is something we would not like to see South Africa do. So I'd be really keen in hearing your responses.
Now read out the questions in the chat box. Okay, thank you very much. Let me respond to this round of questions.
Don't be surprised to see me call the big guns from DERCO. Simon, if you may come and speak into the mic, just want to start with the question whether we are going to file a submission regarding the International Court of Justice. Maybe you can elaborate where we are on that point. Yeah. This is being handled by DERCO. That's why I'm calling DERCO to answer.
Thank you, my fellow ministers. I hope you can hear. Just to confirm that we are indeed going to prepare a submission as South Africa. It is being worked on through the Office of the Chief State Law Advisor. And we have already called and participated in a number of meetings with other countries on this, and we will do many more of those. The deadline for submission is in January next year. So if you have any ideas, we would, obviously appreciate those. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Simon, for that. Andile asked whether the COP is still necessary beyond 2030. As a country and as a continent, we've been trying very hard to shift the COP modality from pure theoretical negotiations to turn it into the implementation phase. And you would have seen that the decisions that came from the African COP, they were more along the line of implementation COP. Fortunately, UAE has promised that they would continue along that line, where we will see the decisions that are more aligned with this implementation phase. Indeed, the IPCC say this is a critical decade, so we want to see a lot of implementation-related decisions. Well, I'm not sure. There was another question about some working group of the IPCC being political and not scientific. All I know is that the IPCC is a scientific body, and I'm the focal point on the IPCC. And as South Africa, we had a co-chair of Working Group 2, and that Working Group 2 dealt with science. To be precise, Working Group 2 assessed 62,000 scientific papers. So I don't know how different that is from science. That is what all the working groups of IPCC use the same modality, which is assessment of scientific literature to come to their findings. So I wouldn't honestly agree that some part of the IPCC is not science. IPCC is purely science. In terms of the position, of course, we will share the presentations that were made, and I think the program director did indicate that the presentations will be shared. And you would see that in some of the presentation that already serve as an input to South Africa's position. So we would gladly welcome any other additional input that people want to put forward. I'm going to leave the question of nuclear to the minister. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and apologies, I just had to go out to vote. With regard to, I think we take all the points that were made by the Premier of KZN, and we absolutely agree that dealing with climate change requires a whole of government approach and a whole of society approach. I think that up until now, we have faced a situation where we have worked with provinces and with municipalities on a voluntary basis, on the basis of interest. And I think the reason that the climate bill is important is it places an obligation on all levels of government and all organs of government to address the climate crisis in their space. It also places an obligation on government to coordinate their work with each other and to synergize policies and approaches. So I think in that sense, when the bill is signed into law, it will indeed help us to ensure that we have this whole of government approach that the Premier of KZN is advocating for. At the moment, we have a working group that falls under what we call MINMEC. MINMEC is the 3 monthly meetings that I have with all the MECs, with SALGA, and also with the mayors of the large cities, where we discuss environmental matters generally. Environmental law has responsibilities at all levels of government, so we do have to coordinate all policies and programs already. And I'm sure in due course, as the bill comes into effect, that working group, which one is it, Marcella? Which working group under MINMEC deals with climate change? Working group 9. I'm sure it's going to become one of the much busier working groups. And obviously, what we can say both to SALGA and to the Premier is that that working group is not a one-way street. It's not a situation where national government brings issues for discussion. It's an issue where any level of government can bring issues that they feel need attention. Absolutely agree with the question of women's voice on the climate crisis. On the issue of the IPCC, the position of the South African government is that we accept the science of the IPCC. That is the formal position of government, and our country has been a significant contributor through our tertiary institutions and other scientific bodies to the body of knowledge that has been developed by the IPCC. And in fact, we had advocated for Professor Deborah Roberts to be the co-chair. Unfortunately, that didn't come about, but it is the formal position of our government that we accept the science. On the issues that Princess was raising on nuclear, energy policy is in the domain of Minister Mantashe, and energy policy is not covered by the Paris Agreement. But I think what is important to say is that nuclear is part of our current energy mix. I've no doubt, given the fact that we are in the process of extending Koeberg's life by another 20 years, it will continue to be part of our energy mix. And I think we know that Koeberg has during this crisis been one of the cheap and reliable sources of energy. Thank you very much.
Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, there was a question about whether the Climate Commission would do a position paper for COP28. And just to clarify, I mean, our mandate is a domestic mandate. So we're very focused on domestic policy, and the international negotiating mandate is led by DFFE, and they've already, Mayasela and the minister have committed already to a consultative process with respect to the way that their mandate is developed. We operate, as Lebogang said earlier, from the perspective of the just transition framework. So we do have views on what's going on at the UNFCCC and have been particularly encouraged by the way that the stocktake is panning out and the kinds of prominence that just transition issues are being given in that stocktake process. So, to the extent that we've got messages around COP, Lebogang gave those this morning, but it's not our mandate to sort of lead on the negotiations. And I just want to echo what the minister was saying about Premier Nomusa Duba's points. I mean, I was really taken by the way she emphasized multi-level action, a collaborative and cooperative approach that involves a wide perspective of stakeholders in this transition. And she pointed to the gap that the stocktake has identified around the adaptation planning and adaptation response. And the stocktake is very clear, our adaptation response as a global community is fragmented, and it doesn't merely take the kind of seriousness of what's happening to our climate system and its impacts. So thank you for those points, Premier.
Thank you very much. We'll now take the last round of questions. We have questions that were deposited in the chat box. Nama, please read them out.
The CBAM, is COP28 the space to push against it, or is it something that would be addressed through the World Trade Organization? Tyler Booth, her question reads, could you share some more information on South Africa's position in Article 6.8? Also, any information on the African Carbon Markets Initiative, given recent scandals unveiled by The Guardian that most of various certified credits have been proven junk. In Liberia, sorry, let's move this up. Liberia conceded 10% of its land to an Emirati company in the name of carbon credits. Francesca de Gasparis, apologies for the pronunciation. Please, can we have clarity on the process of this consultation as it's termed? How will the points made here be able to be incorporated into South Africa's position or taken into consideration? Mutiki Swahle asks, but why carbon tax was introduced in South Africa? The last question is from Archbishop Seraphim Kiotis. Can you let us know about the outcome of the new initiative at COP27 for the new Damage and Loss Fund?
Thank you, Mama. I'm going to take two last questions from the room as we wrap up this session. There's a hand at the back. Yes.
My name is Nthando Saint Mamedela, and I'm part of the Youth Policy Committee at SIRE. And my question is, what is South Africa's stance on innovation and technology? And the reason why I'm asking this is because As much as South Africa can hold its own with regards to talented scientists and technologists, we tend to be swayed by a lot of these advanced technologies from the global north. And most of these technologies promote eco-modernism, which is basically saying that it doesn't matter how we reach our climate goals, even if it means damaging the environment more than before. So rather than building carbon capture technology that allows these fossil fuel companies to keep on doing what they're doing and contributing to the rise of our temperatures, we should instead focus on building smart grids or just building smarter energy systems. So that is something I'd really love to hear from the panel on what South Africa's stance is on technology and innovation, as that is a cross-cutting theme at COP28. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I recognize a hand from this side. Yes.
Hello, my name is Onke Nguka from the Daily Mavericks Our Burning Planet Unit. I just wanted to check in with the JIP and kind of get an update in terms of where it stands at the moment and how whether the funding has been allocated and what projects that has gone to. And also wanted to know if that was going to be further discussed at COP28 and whether the South Africa would be looking into expanding the international partnerships or getting the other member nations of the Africa group to perhaps be considered in forming their own JIPs. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will now invite a round of responses. Colleagues, as I indicated in the beginning, this is the first engagement in terms of the SA negotiating position. I'm going to give out my email address so that those who did not get a chance can still write to the department. We will respond to the comments accordingly. My email address is p.mlengwa@bffe.gov.za. I will also ask the colleagues to share the screen so that those who did not get a chance can still write to us.
Thank you, Peter, and appreciating the questions from the audience. When it comes to the inputs that are being made here, and whether they will be taken on board, my answer is an emphatic yes. We appreciate the inputs. That is how we've managed to be strong all these years as a negotiating team from South Africa. It's simply because of the inputs that we get through this consultation. So definitely we value all inputs and we will take them on board as usual. There was a question that I missed before around Article 6.8. This is Article 6 is really about carbon markets. So 6.2 is about carbon trade. 6.2 is a cooperative approach, and 6.4 is the trade, carbon trade, and 6.2 is the non-market. So this is a proposal that was put forward by countries that are not so industrialized. So the potential for them to be involved is through this 6.8. And I must be honest to say that as we were concluding the technical details on carbon markets, the big focus was on 6.2 and 6.4, because that was what was more familiar to what we had previously under the Kyoto Protocol called the CDM. So 6.8 continues to lag behind in the negotiations. But of course, those negotiations are continuing and the team is engaging in that. Once there is opportunities to be involved in real 6.8 benefits, we will surely do that. But we are engaged in the 6.8 or the so-called non-market discussion. And the last question that I want to address is the one on COP27 loss and damage fund. I think the colleague might have joined a little bit late because we had already said that South Africa, together with the European Union, is co-chairing the design of this loss and damage fund through what we call the Transitional Committee. I'm not sure whether the colleague is asking the question because there was a lot of media attention to the last meeting that happened last week of the Transitional Committee, what they call TC4, where there was no agreement reached. And of course, you might have seen that media highlighted the negative sentiments coming from particularly the US and the EU for lack of conclusion on that matter. But I'm happy to announce that the COP28 incoming presidency has scheduled an extra meeting next week, just after the pre-COP in Abu Dhabi, so that the parties can get space to find one another, and the TC, the Transitional Committee, can then have solid recommendations for the COP. So that is where those negotiations are. There's going to be an additional TC meeting, TC5, next week in Abu Dhabi. Thank you.
Let me start with Lamise's question on CBAM. Lamise, obviously DTIC would be in the forefront of doing work around CBAM. And I can share with you that Minister Patel has worked with the presidency in doing a very thorough analysis on the implications of CBAM for our economy. And that has also been shared with the European Union Commission. Obviously, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, would be the primary site where CBAM would be opposed. But I suppose the question comes as to who wants to introduce CBAM where. So when we went to the Nairobi African Climate Summit, in the draft declaration, there was a suggestion that the African continent should support CBAM. That was rejected by the African delegates at that conference for two reasons. The first is that CBAM fundamentally underlines the spirit of the Paris Agreement and the clause on common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. What CBAM is saying is, regardless of where you are at, what is your state of development, where you are in your transition, a common jurisdiction will apply to you. Now, that fundamentally undermines the principle of the Paris Agreement. But secondly, African countries are opposed to unilaterally imposed non-negotiated trade and tariff measures. So that, if you read the final declaration, you will see that opposition is reflected there. Why did South Africa introduce a carbon tax? I think that the reason that Treasury introduced the carbon tax is because Treasury is of the view that we need to move towards a situation of a lower carbon economy. And I think that what we have to understand is how the climate bill and the carbon tax will work together. What the climate bill does is it allocates carbon budgets to different industries. The question then becomes, what happens if you emit more than your carbon budget? And the answer is you will pay tax. for it. At the moment, the tax is low, but I'm sure that as time progresses, the tax will increase because we know taxes only go one way, right? So I think that the carbon tax is part of the mechanisms of government to encourage industries over a period of time to move towards lower emissions. There's strong support for innovation and technology in the economy in general. Minister Nzimande is a great advocate of improving innovation and technology. And it's an issue that he always raises in relation to all economic matters in cabinet, and in particular with regard to the climate crisis. I think South Africa has very interesting and very unique technology in the Fischer-Tropsch technology, which is owned by Sasol, and will in due course become very significant in the green hydrogen space. So I think that we completely agree with you that part of the way that we will deal with this crisis is through the growth of innovation and technology. Of course, we don't yet know what all of those innovations will be, but it's very important that we continue to put money into research and development. If you look at, we talk a lot about finance, but when we talk about the Paris Agreement, but actually the clause is not finance, it's means of implementation that include technological transfer. And part of the reason for that is that developing countries have less technology than developed countries. But that doesn't mean that South Africa isn't keen to develop our existing scientific and innovation capacity, and that we shouldn't continue to finance that research and development. We think that's very important. On the JET IP, obviously, I thought after I sat down that there was a fourth issue that will be of interest on the sidelines of COP28, and that is the question of just transitions. And there is interest in South Africa's just transition and interest in South Africa's approach to matters relating to the just transition. And I know last year, the Climate Commission hosted a number of events on the sidelines of COP that focused on the question of just transitions. You would have seen from the cabinet statement that was released last week that last week cabinet received an update on the development of the implementation plan, and cabinet was told that it will be ready soon for consideration. And also we were told at that meeting that we have two new partners, the Kingdom of the Netherlands and Denmark, that have joined the partnership. So that really is an update. But obviously, that is primarily a domestic matter. It's not part of the international negotiations. But issues of the just transition and our own experience of it is something that the international community is very interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Last but not least, I will now call upon Mr. Ritumetse Mulitswane, the Head of Environment at the National Business Initiative, to talk about the South Africa Events and Engagement Pavilion at COP28. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon to Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and the participants at this consultation session. I'm going to give you a short insight into the South Africa Pavilion at COP28. This is a joint initiative that has been hosted in partnership with the South African government as well as business over a number of years. So we're continuing this particular tradition, and I will show you shortly just a few slides that speak to what we are expecting in terms of the pavilion and some of the specific work that we've been doing to get ready for the pavilion at COP. Just to confirm, I hope that you can see my presentation and that you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can hear you. We can also see the presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. I won't take too long. As you are aware, and as I've mentioned, the South Africa Pavilion at the various COPs over the past few years has been a joint initiative between business and government, and really speaking to the need for strong partnerships in the implementation of South Africa's climate change response. And the pavilion really provides a space for South Africans who are present at the COP to take part in various conversations, as well as to share insights, stories, particular concerns about the unfolding negotiations and the broader global climate change efforts, as well as their specific role in this particular work. In the past, we've really focused on showcasing South Africa's competitiveness in terms of our climate change response and how this is positioning us into the future, and really telling the story about South Africa's just transition, various aspects as part of a more enhanced and more ambitious climate change response that we've communicated in our updated ABC. So I've just shown on the slide various documents that really speak to the amount of work that is taking place in the country that's speaking to different aspects of the just transition as one of the main topics that's framing how we are looking at climate change. And we'll continue to emphasize and profile at the pavilion going forward. I've just shown you here, just to get a sense of how the pavilion space looks like, it has looked like at previous COPs. It's first and foremost a space where we are able to profile and showcase South Africa's experiences in terms of our transition and the various aspects that need to be dealt with, and really to serve as an anchor, as a base for the South African delegation, and a point where others who are participating in the COP, so really to come through and get a sense of some of the key issues that we're dealing with, and really to engage in robust discussions that speak to how we are transitioning, what are the particular challenges, where are the opportunities, and how do we continue to work together to enhance our ability to respond to climate change in its different aspects. So in the past, we've had really wonderful participation from government as a key stakeholder, and we've had various dignitaries, really high-profile participants coming through to use the pavilion space to engage with the South Africa delegation broadly, as it's composed of government, actors, business, civil society, youth, a whole range of key stakeholders that are really driving South Africa's climate change response in different spaces. And then it's also been a great space for us to be able to unpack many of the key issues that we're dealing with. So really convening, presentations, roundtable sessions, panel discussions that go into the different aspects that we need to be able to address collectively to advance our climate change response, and to understand the different perspectives of the roles, the different actors who are driving this response, and how we can put all of these different aspects and perspectives to a cohesive national narrative that addresses where different stakeholders are coming from and the concerns as well as opportunities that are presented in those respective spaces. I should also highlight that obviously there's a big South African presence in terms of the conversations, but we've also attracted some larger international organizations to get a sense of what South Africans are saying, but also to get some insights internationally that we can also apply in our own spaces when we're back in the country. The communication impact of the pavilion is really significant. So in addition to hosting events, hosting these conversations and panels and so forth, in person at the pavilion, over the past few years, we've also been able to run a hybrid program that allows even those who are not at the COP physically to participate in the conversations, to get a sense of what is happening, and really to broaden the degree of inclusion at the pavilion space itself. It is, I think, a meeting for really wonderful insight into what is happening at the COP itself and how different stakeholders, both nationally and around the world, are experiencing, interacting, responding on various climate change issues and topics that both, relate to mitigation, speaking to social issues, economic issues, and the whole range of related issues that is key in addressing climate change comprehensively and effectively. Just very quickly to give you a sense of what is planned for the pavilion itself. So the pavilion is already being constructed as we speak, but just to highlight really what this pavilion should be speaking to. And, working with the range of, as well as other key stakeholders who provided inputs. We see this COP really as an opportunity to continue to demonstrate our commitment to ambitious climate action. And you've seen some of those documents that are highlighted that speak to the work that's taking place within the country. And in terms of how we are seeing this COP, it's really about reinforcing our ambition and really demonstrating that credibility that we are continuing to work very hard and in a collaborative way towards implementing our transition. That is something that actors are really, pushing in their respective spaces to make sure that we can effect a just transition. And we've highlighted issues around the real economy itself in terms of how the just transition must play out. And also, moving beyond perhaps the mitigation focus that has been linked to the just transition conversation, also continuing to profile and to highlight that adaptation, understanding adaptation risk, making sure that we're able to mobilize the financing that space is a really critical issue. And as throughout the previous COPs that we participated in and hosted this particular pavilion, we're still really talking to this issue of building trust through demonstrative action and showing that there are credible partnerships between different stakeholders that have endured over time and that continue to not only push for, but starting to really practicalize and make concrete the climate change initiatives that we need to see on the ground that speak to the transition, that speak to the urgency of action that's required. In terms of the key messages, I know that a few key messaging aspects have been touched on by different stakeholders today, but in line, I think, with the broader South Africa delegation messaging, I just wanted to highlight that obviously top of mind is the just transition. This is a big topic that continues to really dominate the framing of how we're thinking about climate change, and particularly how it's playing out in the South African space. But in addition to that, the issues around building adaptation, increasing climate resilience are still quite critical. And so these have been elevated in terms of the messaging that's associated with the communications of the pavilion. Loss and damage continues to be a critical issue, and I think increasingly so. We reference, I think, over the past many years, the issues around finance, and these still continue. I think the dimensions and the complexity of the understanding and the nuancing around the understanding of finance has increased, but it still remains something that is really critical to highlight and to continue reflections on in terms of advancing our own climate responses and that of other countries who are ambitious in their actions. And this time around, and I think for the first time in terms of the South African Pavilion, we've also highlighted key issues around biodiversity and how that links to climate change, as well as water, which is really a critical issue for South Africa, and obviously very much linked to how we are adapting and how we're able to build resilience in the face of continued climate change. And as I said before, an enduring theme, a critical part of what the pavilions themselves really want to demonstrate is the importance of these strong partnerships that can drive ambitious action at the scale that is required. As I just near the end of the presentation, just an indication that in terms of where the COP itself in the South Africa Pavilion will be located. So as you may be aware, the COP is taking place at the Expo City in Dubai. So we have an understanding already of where the pavilion will be located. It will be a base and a place to which South Africans, but others are welcome as well to hear the stories that are being shared and the insights and the information, as well as to participate in the conversation, the panels, and really the robust discussions that we anticipate will be taking place at the pavilion. I haven't shared the pavilion program itself because this is still under development. At this point in time, we are looking at over 53 events. So at the previous COP, we hosted 56 events, and that was really pushing the limit in terms of the number of hours that are available to us over the COP period. So we are looking forward to a very robust program. We will be closing the scheduling in terms of the inputs that we've received thus far over the next 2 weeks. We will make the full pavilion schedule available. As I mentioned, people are able to participate not only in person, but are also able to join the sessions online and have a sense of the conversations and really be part of the discussions that are taking place. So we will be publishing the schedule of events as well as the details that allow those who are not present at the COP itself to be able to join or to also see some of these proceedings at the pavilion on the various platforms like YouTube, so forth. And so we will have a full schedule, which we anticipate sharing within the second week of November, that people are able to specify time for the specific sessions that they would like to be part of and that they would like to participate in. I think I will stop the presentation at this point. I'm happy to take questions either now or people want to ask directly to me for any additional information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timothy. I think the presentation was straightforward. Colleagues, we have come to the end of this session. Thank you very much to all the stakeholders in the room, as well as those who joined us virtually. I would like to invite the media to set up outside in the notes for interviews. Thank you.